Devil's Mauraders. Written by William King. Read by Adam Nicol. All rights reserved to the original author. This is a non-profit reading of Devil's Mauraders.
"They're coming," said Nipper, peering out into the jungle. Even with his night-sight goggles set to max, he couldn't really see anything, but he could tell something was wrong. The jungle was too still, everything was too calm. He had a crawling feeling between his shoulder blades. That feeling had kept him alive for nearly 6 months in the steaming wastes of Herathia. He respected his intuition. "I can't see anything," Borsky said. Nipper turned to look at him. In the moonlight filtering down from topside, the commissar looked even more skeletal than usual. Amazing how he manages to keep that uniform so clean, Nipper thought. Everybody else looks like they've been swimming in a pool of sweat, but not Borsky. His trench coat was immaculate. His silver skull buttons gleamed. His youthful, fanatic face gazed out from beneath his peaked cap through a transparent spore mask. "If Nipper says there's something out there, sir, then I believe him," Sergeant Krask said, hesitantly. Borsky glanced over at the sergeant as if he could measure Krask's devotion to the Emperor at a glance. "Very well, soldiers. Lock and load. Ogrin, the Emperor wants you to ready the grenade launcher." "Sure thing, sir," said Truck worshipfully. "Truck is ready to dine." Nipper watched the huge Ogrin raise the heavy weapons like a toy. Truck grinned at him. He looked like he was enjoying himself. It was hard to believe that he was the last survivor of the company's Ogrin section. Nipper considered the comrades he'd lost in the previous 3 nights fighting, and was anything but cheerful. He turned his attention back to the jungle, trying to ignore the pain-filled moan of Lieutenant Mickles. A small sucker leech crawled across Nipper's combat jacket, and he swatted it with one heavy gauntleted hand. He wiped his palm on his thigh before adjusting his spore mask. "Need to change the filter as soon as possible," he thought. It was only a temporary distraction. "What's wrong?" he wondered. "Why am I so uneasy?" "No tree swingers," Sal said. Nipper looked at the little sanctioned psyker. She'd crawled over to where he was and lay on her stomach beside him. He noted her lovely face on top of her thin, twisted body. He saw eyes and teeth discoloured by the crimson stain of the witch spore addiction. "She has a strange beauty," he thought. "Thank you," Sal said. Nipper felt his face flush. Sal's talent was intermittent, but her mind-reading ability was at a peak tonight. She had been taking huge doses of witch spore to enable her to track the rebels. It had amplified her powers greatly. Suddenly, what she said sank in. "Hey, Sergeant. No fuzzy monkeys." He pointed upwards to topside, straining to make out movement through the clouds of spores that drifted in the moonlight. "That's it," Borsky said, drawing his pistol. "Prepare to hold your positions, men. For the Emperor!" "Commissar, I can feel mind forms moving about half a click east. Human, but strangely distorted. Feels like rebels." Sal looked deeply disturbed. She said there was something about the minds of their foe that made her uneasy. Nipper thought he understood. Delving into the minds of heretics must be upsetting. The 30 or so survivors of A Company were taking up their prepared positions. Everybody was tired after 3 days of daytime sniping and nighttime warfare. They had been ordered to hold this position for as long as possible before falling back. So far, they had blocked the rebel offensive, but tonight Nipper did not doubt the heretics would break through. All around him he could see the green ready lights of weapons wink as their owners made final checks. The familiar litany of the weaponeers' chants filled his ears. "Emperor save us," muttered Nipper worriedly, his nerves frayed by the 3 long days of combat. He was singled out for Borsky's special attention. "The Emperor will aid you only, and only if you fight bravely," the Commissar thundered, "and the demons of hell will take all cowards. I will personally see to that." The religious intensity in Borski's voice made Nipper shiver. The Commissar had risen in full view of his men, ignoring any possible cover. Nipper had to admire his courage. If the Emperor protects the brave, then he will certainly look over Borski, Nipper admitted. Some of the Commissar's unshakable certainty in his own righteousness transmitted itself to Nipper. He prayed silently to the Emperor, and the rest of the company seemed similarly enthused. The whining and quiet chatter had stopped. "Our faith is our shield," said Borski. "We are weapons in the fist of the Emperor, and we will be worthy. We will smite the unrighteous." Nipper turned to see movement among the distant trees of the nation. branches of the nation trees. "Trees out," said Truck. All around him the jungle seemed to burn. From overhead came blinding laser flashes as rebel jet bikes swooped insanely over topside. Nipper raised his laser and snapped off a quick shot. He'd hit a bike pilot in the face. The wounded man leaned forward on the controls, and the bike nosedived. Nipper could see his gunner trying to jump clear. Nipper tracked its fall, ready to shoot any survivors. The jet cycle hit a weak patch in the carpet moss and vanished from view. Nipper heard the long scream, followed by a splash. He shuddered. The things that lived below, in the eternal wet darkness beneath the nation tree's roots, were things he had nightmares about. "Nipper, down!" he heard Borski shout. Without thinking, he threw himself flat on the greenside floor. A stream of bolt pistol fire passed from where he'd just been standing, and he saw the point of impact. Saw a tall, thin warrior in the camouflage uniform of the rebels fall. He turned to thank the Commissar, but he'd already moved on, rushing towards the cover of a muck fungus tree. Laser fire withered the carpet moss beneath his feet. Nipper rolled over and searched for the firer. He saw a huge dark figure moving among the shadows of a nearby tree. He brought up his las rifle and sent a full-intensity burst towards his target. Brilliant white fire played over it. "Burn, heretic," thought Nipper. He felt a thrill of fear as the figure refused to fall. His finger slackened on the trigger. He could make out the details as the rebel advanced towards him, and his heart sank. Robot. One obviously modified to find its way through the greenside. One hand was a chainsword. The other had a heavy bolter, which he was trying laboriously to bring to bear on Nipper. He could hear the whine of the servo motors as the arm moved. The heavy plasteel of its carapace had melted and ran where Nipper's laser had struck. It was painted with several strange and disturbing rules. Nipper leapt back as it opened fire. Explosive bullets churned the carpet moss where he had been standing. He cast a glance towards the nearest cover. Too far, he thought. I'll never make it. He grinned as adrenaline raced through his body. His circle of awareness seemed to expand as he waited for the bullets to rip through him. He turned, and he could make out the tiny webwork of engraving on the robot's carapace, hear the crack of small arms fire, and the screams of the dying. Everything seemed distinct and discreet. He could hear his breath rumble within his chest, hear the individual movement of every muscle. He stared down at the barrel of that huge-seeming gun. Facing death, he felt totally alive. He rolled to one side, and the robot's arm seemed to track as if in slow motion. He raised his own weapon and reached for the action of the grenade launcher. Only one chance, he thought. Better get it right. He came to rest and fired the grenade. It arced towards the robot's feet and detonated. Nipper felt the force of the explosion ripple the carpet moss. He looked back at the robot. It stood still. I'm dead, thought Ripper. Then the robot seemed to slowly disappear. It vanished from view and fell. As Nipper had intended, the grenade had weakened the moss beneath it. He let out a long breath. It felt good to be alive. He noticed more rebels advancing among the trees. Their full-face spore masks and bulging goggles made them look like horrible insects. He saw that they too had strange runes on their chest where badges of honour should have been. Fall back, he heard Borski shout. There was a note of bitterness in the Commissar's voice. He did not relish sounding the retreat. Nipper ran towards his own lines. Each step seemed to take forever. He felt light, as if he was walking on the moon. Laser beams blurred past his head, almost blinding him. Miraculously, None hit him. Under the shadow of swooping jet bikes, he reached the cover of a snapwort bush. A familiar figure huddled behind it, a las pistol in hand. "Leave me," Sal said. "Save yourself." Her wounds looked worse than they were. The long, sticky leaves of the vampire plant fondled them obscenely, looking for blood. Nipper looked out from his cover. Flitting from hole to hole were hundreds of rebel troopers. From above them, a heavily modified jet cycle gave covering fire. The enemy had broken through. Nipper checked Sal's filter mask. It was still completely in place. Good. He unclipped some med plaids from his belt and sprayed the wounded area. "That should kill any spores," he muttered, watching the Plasifletch congeal. He hoped that the disinfectant fungicide worked better than the last lot, or else Sal was in for a painful death. "I mean it, Nipper. Go. If you're still here when the rebels come, they'll—" "No can do, Sal," he said. "You know the code." She looked up at him and smiled in spite of her pain. "The Mauraders look after their own. Nipper, we're not back on Thranks, and this isn't a street fight." "Hey, if we don't look after each other, no one else will." Suddenly, Sal's face went slack. He knew that she was in a listening trance. A moment later, intelligence flooded back into her face. "Boski and Trask have the rest of them about 200 meters back. They're heading for the old comm hutch. Go the way I tell you. I think we'll have a clear run." Nipper nodded. "Can you run, Sal?" "I'll have to." Just before they made the break, she turned and looked back at the oncoming enemy. An expression of fear passed across her face. "By the Emperor, they hate us so," she said. She and Nipper ran. From behind came the sounds of sporadic firing as the rebels mopped up the last of the opposition. "We're on our own," Boski said, with a certain grim satisfaction. He looked like a man who had just found a big enough challenge to measure his faith against. He cut the comm link with HQ as Lieutenant Mickles cried out in agony. Wonderful, Nipper thought, looking around the old harvester's cabin that some dead tech adept had converted into a communications nexus. It had a familiar homey look. He'd grown up surrounded by machinery, not giant plants. For a moment he felt homesick for a place far beyond his ability to measure distance. He slumped wearily down on the hard bench. He was tired, as much as the brief firefight as the night of marching that had followed. He didn't want to think about that nightmarish journey through the green. He had to partially carry Sal whilst keeping alert from any threats from the surrounding forest. Once he'd almost been ensnared by a dream spider's web. Several times he'd nearly fallen through the carpet moss to Swampside 30 meters below. Twice he'd had to hide, frozen with fear, whilst rebel scouts filtered by. It had taken them what felt like forever to reach the communications hutch. He looked around at the few survivors of A Company. He saw Boski, the Sarge, Lieutenant Mickles, Truck. There were a few familiar faces from the old days when the Devil's Marauders had been a street gang on the world city of Thranks. That had been before the Raising, when they had been fierce and desperate enough to be inducted into the Imperial Guard. By the Emperor, there had been nearly 100 of them then. Now, there was only himself and Sal, Hunt, Glynn, Mac, and Colquhoun. His friends had changed. They still wore their gang colours, but they had been incorporated into the uniform of the Guard. The only real sign of their former alliance was a huge devil head on the backs of their combat jackets. They still had the old face tattoos, but the faces themselves were thinner, gaunt, and haunted, patched with scars. Hunt had a bionic eye, visible under his face mask. Mac had an arm of plasteel and servo motors. There was a taste in the air of low morale. All the others are dead, or in the hands of rebels, Nipper thought. He didn't know which was worse. Mickles whimpered again. "No chance of any support," Trask asked. The Sarge looked tireder than any man had a right to be and still be alive. He'd carried the terribly wounded Mickles all night on his own. "None," Boski said sternly. "The heretics have begun a massive offensive right across Blue Zone. Still, the righteous will prevail. Within one standard day, divine retribution will cleanse this whole zone with an orbital bombardment. We have been ordered to fall back." "What?" Krask was both frightened and bewildered. Nipper broke. Anything that scared Krask terrified Nipper. He'd never seen the sergeant display anything but laconic cool. "That's madness," Krask muttered. "The whole reason for sending us into the jungle in the first place was to drive Governor Damien's rebels out without damaging the witch spore crop. That was before the full scale of the insurrection was realized." Borsky looked, almost gently. "We did not realize the cancer of heresy had spread so deep. We are not facing simply a rebel garrison, but many of the native tribes of the interior. They're armed, and they're allied with something dark and terrible. They bear its mark." For the first time, Nipper thought he detected a trace of what might be fear in the commissar's voice. He thought back to the strange runes he'd seen on the robot. He'd heard stories, muttered tales, of demons who existed in the dark between worlds and sought to undermine the works of the righteous. He had always dismissed them as stories to frighten children. Behind him, Sal muttered, "It makes sense. Where better for them to strike than on the world where witch spore comes from? Many latents would have their powers brought to the fore." Nipper wondered what she was talking about. He knew that psychers were dangerous. The priests of the Imperial cult told everybody so. Only ones who'd been bonded to the Emperor, or who had undergone the terrible training to become sanctioned, could be allowed to live. Could those who had not been bonded provide some sort of gateway for enemies of the Emperor? Nipper felt Sal nudge him in the ribs. She gave him a warning look. "You are on dangerous ground," she whispered. "Best not to even think of such mysteries." Another, more pressing problem struck Nipper. He addressed Borsky. "Sir, if they're going to cleanse this place in 24 hours, what happens to us? We are ordered to fall back to Zone Amber." Mikkels reached out imploringly. His eyes filled with pain. "Commissar, I am wounded. I will only slow you down on the march. I have failed the Emperor. I seek atonement." Borsky looked down at him. Cold eyes hooded. He nodded. "Very well. Soldiers outside. Prepare to depart." The guards left the hut. From within came the sound of a single shot, and Borsky emerged, alone. "Now we must go," he said. "Zone Amber is 50 clicks away. We'll never get there before bombardment starts," Nipper said. Borsky showed his chilling smile. "Then we will die joyous in the knowledge that we have served our Emperor well," he said. Wearily, the survivors pushed on through the nation forest. Dawn had come, bringing a wash of green light down through the topside. Nipper watched the endless tides of airborne spores rise on currents, dazzling dragon moths, as long as a man's arm pursued shoals of glitterflies. Sometimes puffballs would roll out onto the main branch, and Truck would kick them, laughing moronically as they exploded. Only Truck did not seem oppressed by their surroundings, and the fact that they were merely 20 hours away from being reduced to a plasmatic state by orbital bombardment. Nipper wondered how he could have ever liked this place. It had seemed so fresh and amazing to him 6 months ago, a riot of green life erupting across the continent. From 200-meter-high trees to the triple-tiered ecology they supported. It had been wonderful to a boy from the steel corridors of the hive world of Thranx. He had marvelled at the differences between the layers. It had delighted him that topside, with its swinging monkeys and bright sunlight, was as different from greenside as that was from the devil python-infested swamps below. He could well remember his first sight of topside, an endless garden of flowers visible from the armoured aircar's glass steel windows. He could remember the terror of his first patrol, hunting raiders in the eternal darkness of the swamps at the nation tree's roots. Even that had held a strange kind of wonder, as they had walked across the rippling surface on pontoon shoes, whilst pale beasts scuttled from the light of their torches. But it had been greenside he had loved the best. He had marvelled at the way branches of the great trees had intermeshed so tightly that carpet moss could grow between them, to form a near-solid surface, which could, mostly, support a man's weight. It had seemed miraculous that it was all supported underneath by the steel-hard cable webs of the weavers. It was so perfect, it could have almost been designed by a god. Even now that the initial glamour had faded, it still seemed slightly blasphemous to him that it was about to be vaped from orbit. He looked up at the cathedral-like arches of the trunks rising above him and shook his head, like he could shake his feelings as easily as a dog shaking off water. He couldn't. This place dwarfed him, as it dwarfed the straggling line of his companions, even the mighty truck. "You're right," Sal said from beside him. She was looking up at him with a strange expression on her face, as if she was seeing him for the first time. "We don't belong here." "We don't fit, do we?" he said. "Everything else here is symmetry, contributes something to the pattern about us. Even the rebels have learned to blend in a weird sort of way. That's why they're beating us." Sal smiled. "Symmetry. It's because this world was designed by bioadapts during the dark age of technology. That's what the records say. I was in the mind of a clerk who was transcribing the report back at drop site." Sal fell silent. Nicol looked down at her. She was pale and drawn. Already lines of pain and fatigue were etched into her face. She stumbled and almost fell, but Nipper supported her. She did not ask to rest. Nipper guessed, like the rest of them, she knew she would be left behind. 6 hours into their march, they found the body. It was that of a man. He had been left stretched out in the glistening coils of a dream spider's web. His mask had been torn away, and fungus emerged from his mouth, nostrils, and eyes. Nipper thought it was a ghastly way to die. Lungs filled and insides eaten away by the parasitic fungus. But yet the man was smiling. The narcotic strands of the web had done their work. He could see the dream spider retreating from its decomposing prey as they approached. Krask looked at the body, a haunted look in his face. "What's wrong?" Borsky asked. "Look at the man's clothing, sir. He's wearing green bark cloth and carrying a spore harvesting pouch. He's one of our loyalist scouts." "So?" Nipper understood. "A man like that knows the forest. He wouldn't blunder into a dream spider's web." "Someone put him there?" Borsky looked thoughtful. "Rebel woods runners. The natives believe that the web of a dream spider ensnares the soul. It's the worst form of death in their book. We lost a man up near Spook Mountain last spring. They'd done the same thing." "This means the rebels already passed our outpost line. Weapons at the ready. Be wary of ambush." Without any great enthusiasm, the guards began to check their weapons. Gingerly, they passed the web. For some time afterwards, as he and Sal limped down the trail, Nipper could feel the dead man's calm, ecstatic eyes staring at his back. Nipper fearfully surveyed the surrounding woods, looking for any signs of rebel woods runners. He knew that if they were concealed, his chances were slim. The natives wore camouflage suits and were experts in blending in with the terrain. He paused for a minute and placed the stim injector on the conduit on his filter mask. There was a hiss of gas, and he breathed deep. Artificial energy surged through him, and he suddenly felt strong and alert, as if he could count the leaves on all the nearby trees. He knew the feeling would not last, and in the end would leave him feeling worse, but at the moment he needed some encouragement to trudge on. He offered the injector to Sal, but she shook her head. "Perhaps it interferes with the powers," he thought. "That's right," she said. "I'd go bug crazy if I mixed that stuff with witch spore. It's bad enough having to try and tune everybody out all the time, but when you're on stim, everything's so loud it hurts." Nipper looked at her. For the first time he considered that her gift may also be a curse. He'd always imagined what fun it would be to be able to listen in on other people's thoughts, what advantages he could take from it, how godlike it must feel to have that power. He never considered that it might have its disadvantages as well. Sal smiled knowingly at him. He felt a brief flash of resentment. "Damn spy," he thought. She shook her head and looked away. Almost at once he was sorry. She'd been a good friend to him. It was just that he'd never seen her power so active before. She seemed to be reading him all the time, as if the proximity of death had tripped a switch within her, turning her power up to full. It was disturbing for him, but he could live with it. He squeezed her shoulder. "Sorry," he said, but she did not reply. He noticed that her eyes were closed, and she was once more in trance. Her eyes snapped open, and Nipper could see the panic in them. "They're out there," she said. "East and west. About 20 of them. They're running parallel to us." Overhead, the restless movement of the trees had stopped. The tree swingers were gone. "Commissar, should we stop?" inquired Krask. "We could make a stand." Borsky turned and glared into the jungle, keen, fanatic eyes searching. "What are they waiting for?" Krask shrugged. "Maybe for us to tire or make camp. Maybe there's something ahead we don't know about. Best be wary." "I doubt we could surprise them," Borsky said. "Best that we continue southward as swiftly as possible. We have our orders. Commissar, Truk would like to fight. Truk will wait for enemy. Cover others. Borsky looked at him. The Emperor appreciates your bravery, Ogrin, but that will not be necessary. We'll see action soon enough, Mac muttered. Nipper examined the enemy trees carefully, but he could see no sign of the enemy. Nipper examined the nearby trees carefully, but he could see no sign of the enemy. He was not reassured. He had known men to pass within 2 meters of rebel scouts who had killed them, and they had never noticed their killers. He cast an uneasy glance at the sky. Up there was another invisible threat that was just as deadly. By now the divine retribution would be in position, merely awaiting the command to fire. He checked his wristwatch. 10 hours to go. Glynn died first. A hail of magnetically accelerated shuriken ripped through his body. Nipper saw a dozen cuts appear on Truk, and the Ogrin looked around bemused, as if he did not feel any pain. He was searching for the source of the attack. Nipper flung Sal to one side and threw himself flat into the hollow of the main branch they had been following. He peered around, but could see no sign of the enemy. He knew shuriken catapults were perfect for jungle warfare. They accelerated their razor-edged weapons to a speed where they could penetrate almost any body armor. They were rapid-firing, and they were silent. All rebel scouts carried them. Nipper lay quiet, feeling his flesh crawl, expecting at any moment to be shredded by their hidden assailants. "Nipper," Sal said, "that tree. 50 meters southward. About 5 meters up." He stared at where she directed. He thought he saw something just as he heard Hunt scream. The cry was cut off by a horrible gurgling sound, as blood clogged Hunt's throat. Now Nipper could make out the outlines of a humanoid form. It was almost invisible, so perfectly did it fit and blend into its surrounding green. Sweat rolled down Nipper's face. He made himself take careful aim at the target, all the time fighting to hold down the fear that the rebel was drawing a bead on him. He opened fire, praying to the Emperor that his aim was true. He saw a line of fire blacken the branches he had aimed for, and he heard a scream of intolerable pain, and it seemed for one obscene moment like the tree was screaming. Then something fell from the tree onto the carpet moss below. For a second it was conspicuous, a green body on the brown forest floor, but then it seemed to vanish as the suit did its work. Nipper looked at Sal. "Where are the rest?" She concentrated. "They seem to have pulled back out of range. I think it was a lone sniper. Hunt and Glynn are dead. I felt them die." Her face was white, and she seemed close to tears. Nipper was truly glad he was not a psyker. It was bad enough watching comrades die, but feeling it from the inside must be dreadful, he thought. There was a void inside him, a vacuum. He had known the two men for most of his life, and now they were gone. He shook his head. He noticed how drawn Sal looked. A tick twitched far back in her jaw. Her eyes were wild and staring. He wondered how much of this she could take. He wondered how much of this he could take. Wearily, he checked his chrono. 8.5 hours left. "Don't worry," he told her. "We'll make it." He wished he sounded more convincing. One foot in front of the other, Nipper thought. And again. And again. And again. It was physically painful for him to move now. It was as if a great weight had been attached to each foot, and he had to swing it to move. He no longer watched the forest for rebel scouts. He was past caring. There were times when he would have welcomed being cut down by enemy fire. It would have put him out of his misery. The forest had become a green hell. His companions were the damned souls on the way to purgatory. The light hurt his eyes, and the trees seemed like giant, looming demons. It was as if the forest had taken on a malevolent sentience and mocked them. It sneered at the tiny people who crawled across its body like ants. "Well, you get yours," Nipper thought feverishly. "You won't laugh when the divine retribution blasts you right out of existence." Behind him Sal was a constant drag, pulling at him like the gravity of a black hole, slowing his steps, draining his energy. Her eyes were half closed. Her movements were stiff. Nipper felt that if she had not been leaning against him, she would have fallen right off the main branch. By the Emperor, he would have probably fallen over himself if she had not been there. From behind him, he could hear Truk singing in a deep, tuneless bass. He seemed to be repeating the same words over and over again, occasionally changing the order in which they went. The monotony worked on Nipper's frayed psyche. It was exquisite torture. Ahead of them, Mac and Colquhoun bickered like two drunk men. Their arguments had the relentless circuitry of two people too wary to think. They were reduced to making statements that they had said before. Their song had become mantras, as leached of meaning as Truck's song. "We shall wait and ambush those demon-loving scumsuckers," said Mac, flexing his metallic fingers. "Nah, we should push on back to Zone Amber. Before the bombardment, otherwise we'll all fly. Look, if Damien's little buddies get us, we won't care about the bombardment. We'll all be dead anyway." Suddenly, there was an edge of hysteria to Colquhoun's voice. "We've got to move! That way we can keep ahead of them. They know terrain. They're natives. We'll never outrun them." They seemed to be about to come to blows. "Silence!" said Borsky, his voice cut through all the other noise. "Such bickering is unseemly among the Emperor's chosen troops. You are a disgrace to the uniform." Both Mac and Colquhoun stiffened and pulled themselves up. They said nothing, but nodded shamefaced, and began to march with renewed vigour. 6 hours, thought Nipper. Let them pass quickly. All I want is an end to this. He stumbled, and both he and Sal fell. It was nearly a minute before they could get up again. They came to a vast open space between the nation trees. All around, the forest was burnt. Nipper looked down. For a moment his curiosity overcame his weariness. Already, weavers were throwing their silk cables across the gap. He could see a huge web, brilliant in the green light. It was anchored against the bolts of the newer trees. Strands of carpet moss were starting to fill in the gaps, and he could see that the dull lumps of the weavers as they continued their work. It was hard to believe that the mindless dog-sized arachnids could build such a perfect structure. At this moment, he found he could believe that they were the products of the dark age of technology. "What goes this?" Borsky asked. Krast looked up and looked again at the edge of the webbing. "Crash," he said. Nipper saw that above them a huge swathe of topside had been cleared away. In the clear sky he could see the hive balloons floating, their long stinger lines dangling. Nipper moved to the edge of the burnt-out area and looked down. He peered into the gloom. Something was half buried in the swamp below. He upped the magnification of his goggles and saw that it was an armoured transport flyer. It looked like a gigantic beetle. "Side's been torn out of it," Krast said. "Somebody must have hit it with a rocket launcher. It's no use to us." Nipper shook his head. He wondered who had been on the flyer, whether he'd known any of the people for whom the vehicle was a coffin. It all just seemed so futile. "What are we doing here?" he asked himself, walking the surface of a world so far from home that the distance is incomprehensible. "Fighting people I don't even know, against whom I have no quarrel. In this jungle, thousands of people are dying. For what? The glory of the Emperor? The dreams of an insane governor?" He was shocked to find himself thinking such thoughts. They ran totally against his training, his indoctrination. What had happened to him? Once he had been proud to be a guardsman, to fight for the safety of the Empire. Now he just felt hollow. He was thinking like a heretic. He was suddenly ashamed of himself. He was staining the honour of the regiment for which so many of his comrades had died. He looked over at Borsky and envied him his faith. Nipper had reached the limits of his. He felt an overwhelming urge to go to the Commissar, confess his failure, to say that he was unworthy to be a soldier of the Emperor, and to beg for release from the endless fear that the Commissar's gun would bring him. He was afflicted by a weariness not only of the body, but of the spirit. It seemed pointless to go on. Even if, by some miracle, he escaped the bombardment, he would just be sent back out into the jungle to fight again. He did not want that. He had failed. The only thing left to do was atone. He began to move towards the Commissar. He felt Sal clutch at his hand with desperate strength. "No, Nipper, don't," she said. "We can do it. If only you can make yourself go on." He tried to shake her off. "I can't make it without your help," she said imploringly. He looked down at her. She seemed desperate. He could not let her down. He may not feel capable of living up to the imperial tradition of discipline and self-sacrifice, but this was personal. The Mauraders looked after their own. They trudged on, a step at a time, away from the abyss. Behind them, the weavers continued to work mindlessly, unaware of the passing of men or the imminence of their own doom. Only 3 more hours, Nipper thought, and then it will be over, one way or another. It will be over. I can put off death that long. I think they're getting ready to attack, Sal said. Nipper had thought he was too tired to be afraid, but suddenly found he wasn't. You sure? He said. She nodded. They've been following us all this time. They thought we might lead them to a hidden base. Now they're getting impatient. Something seems to be affecting their minds. They want to kill. You hear that, Sergeant? Nipper asked. Krask nodded and muttered something to Borsky. The commissar straightened up and brushed spores off from the cuff of his uniform. Break out what's left of your stim. We are going to kill some heretics. Nipper emptied the inhaler and felt the trickle of nervous energy pass through him. It was enough to make him alert. He saw Mac and Colquhoun looking at him. I wonder, he thought, do I look like that? There was a jerky quality to the other guards' movements, and their eyes seemed dead behind their bubble goggles. They cocked their heads like caricatures of people listening, assumed postures of exaggerated wariness. They looked so ridiculous that Nipper almost laughed. But he recognized the side effect of the drug and fought to bring the mad hilarity under control. It's going to be dark soon, Krask said. That's when they'll attack. This looks like as good a place as any to defend, Borsky said crisply. Krask, use your chainsaw to cut down those fungus trees. That'll give us some cover. A feeling almost of relief swept over the other marauders. They seemed happy. It was as if they were tired of running, as if they had already given up on their lives and relished the chance of some action. At least it would be a break from the monotony of the march, Nipper said. Nipper found himself thinking. Still, he was full of fear. Come on, muttered Colquhoun. They'd been waiting 20 minutes and there was still no sign. Their drug-induced energy was starting to fade. Lying behind their fungal barricades reminded them of how tired they were. Darkness swept over the dense forest like a wave. Crook is feeling peckish, the Ogren said. Borsky stared at Sal. Are you sure they're going to attack Psyker? Yes, Commissar, she said. She drew her last pistol and was inspecting it carefully. They're out there now, about 200 meters in closing. They're advancing warily. They wonder what we're up to. Keep your eyes peeled then, soldiers, Borsky said. Nipper sighted in the direction Sal had indicated. He ventured a quick glance at the sky, visible through a gap in the foliage. Was that rapidly moving star the divine retribution, he wondered, or just the nearest planet? He checked the time. Under an hour until the bombardment starts, he thought. How far had they come? He was sure it wasn't far enough. It was strange. Earlier, filled with shame and his own weakness, he'd wanted to die. Now, when death seemed imminent, he found he desperately wanted to live. He was filled with disgust. Truly, I am a spineless creature, he thought. Was that movement he saw? He felt a thrill of fear pass through him. He stared at a patch of shadow suspiciously. No, he thought, just jumping. Adrenaline was pumping through his system, and the tiredness was beginning to recede. Was that shadow lengthening? It was, and in no natural way. Emperor, guide my hand, he prayed, and squeezed the trigger of his light rifle. There was a hum as the weapon generator kicked in. A perfectly straight beam of light crackled through the night and hit the shadow, illuminating the figure of a man. Nipper heard a scream. In the torchlight of the burning figures, other rebels were revealed. All of a sudden, everybody was firing. Nipper saw the flash of las fire at the corner of his eye, partially dampened by his protective goggles. He saw the strange coughing sound of the grenade launcher as Truck fired it. A brilliant explosion shattered the night. Nipper saw rebel bodies tumble through the air away from the point of impact. He felt vibration ripple through the carpet moss. Mist rose from the fungus tree trunk. For a second he wondered what was happening, then he realized that the shuriken darts were hitting it. He took a wild guess at where they were coming from and fired a burst in that direction. He was rewarded with a shout of pain. He dropped flat just as a hail of shuriken hissed through the air where he'd been. Pure terror surged through him. That had been too close. Once more the ground trembled. Once more he heard the sound of explosion. He fought the urge to remain still, to huddle up in a ball and beg for mercy. He remained frozen in place. He could not move. Tears streamed down his face. Suddenly, a shadow passed over him. He cringed with fear, forced himself to look up. It was Borsky. He looked calm and unafraid. "Get up, soldier," he said, ignoring the hail of darts which blurred past him. Nipper shook his head. Borsky raised his pistol and snapped a shot off into the distance. Nipper heard a ricochet, saw Borsky grimace with annoyance, like a man who just missed a target on a practice range. He fired again, and something close by groaned. "You can die like a cringing dog, or like a soldier of the Imperium," Borsky said. His voice carried clearly over the noise of battle. He fired again. The noise of his pistol seemed impossibly loud. "Be quick! Your soul is in peril!" Momentarily, the noise of battle seemed to recede. Nipper looked up at the face of the Commissar. Borsky was strong and certain. His faith seemed to shield him as he stood amid the hail of enemy fire. Nipper knew his own hopelessness and lack of faith, and felt diminished. He was filled with terror at the certainty of his own death. It turned his limbs to liquid. He tried to make himself move. "We all die in the end," he told himself. "It is the matter of our dying that counts." Insight filled him. He knew, as Borsky knew, that they were going to die here. That being the case, he had nothing to fear. His fate was already sealed. There was nothing he could do to alter it. His only choice was the way he met his end. Borsky was setting him an example of how to do it. He smiled up at the Commissar and rose to his feet. Borsky nodded, satisfied. "The correct decision," he said. "You are a true guardsman." Then his face was blown away by a hail of shuriken. Nipper looked at him and screamed. A red haze fell over Nipper, and he twisted, firing insanely into the oncoming rebels. He vaulted to the top of the tree stump he'd been cowering behind and set his las rifle for full coverage. Howling with rage, he sprayed the enemy. He clicked the single-shot grenade launcher and fired again. An explosion racked the air. He continued to fire until his rifle powered down. His terror had been transmuted into berserk fury. Filled with rage, he charged his enemy, miraculously avoiding being shot. "The Emperor protects me," he thought crazily. He began laying around him with the butt of his rifle, crunching into the rebels with insane strength. "Follow me, Marauders," he yelled. "For the Emperor, for Borsky, for our dead." Suddenly he was the centre of a swirling melee. He could hear the crack of small arms fire and the gleeful shouts of Truck as he went hand to hand with the foe. Nipper picked up a chainsaw from the hands of a dead rebel NCO and began to lay around him. Everywhere he struck, a man died. "The Emperor guides my hand and fills my heart with fury," he thought. The others emerged to join him in the fight. Soon the enemy were routed, unable to face Nipper's insane anger. As he watched them depart, Nipper did not think they would return. He fell to his knees and wept. "Halt! Identify yourselves," said a voice in Imperial Gothic. "A Company of the 5th Thraxian Regiment, Devil's Marauders," replied Krask. "Pretty small company," replied the sentry. Nipper agreed. Only Mac, Krask, Sal, Truck and himself were left out of all the people who'd set out. The Ogrin carried the body of Commissar Borsky under one arm. "Any more disrespect and I'll have you shot," said Krask, in his best imitation of Borsky's tone. "Where are we, anyway?" Nipper heard the sentry gulp. "Pretty far south, sir. Perimeter station, Amber 12. We're inside Zone Amber, then?" "Yes, sir. 5 clicks." Nipper felt relief flood through him. He looked forward to getting some sleep in a relatively secure camp. Sentry spoke again. "You've just made it in time." "I know," Krask said. "How could you, sir? We've only just got the order. We've got to fall back to Zone Grey. The enemy have broken through Amber perimeter. The Divine Retribution is going to bombard this area from orbit in 24 hours. Nipper felt like screaming. Behind them, death fell from the sky, and the sector that they had just left caught fire. From where he stood, it seemed to Nipper as if the whole world was burning. Have been listening to Devil's Marauders, written by William King and read by rights reserved to William King and Games Workshop. This has been a non-profit fan reading of Devil's Marauders. Find more audiobooks at www.oldoilhouse.co.uk.